This is Alisa by Casper Croes, a fixed camera horror adventure for the PS1. The game was released in 1996 and for a long time was one of Resident Evil's biggest rivals.
Stop it!
Just kidding, this came out in 2021, but it doesn't look a day younger than 29, does it? Let's start again. This is Alisa, an indie survival horror unwaveringly committed to the days of old. The second I saw this game, I became obsessed and knew I had to make a video on it. An old school action horror where you're trapped in a creepy mansion filled with puzzles and monsters and the main character wears a Victorian doll's dress. This feels like it was made for me. Which I guess you wouldn't really know because all I've ever talked about in detail on this channel are the Silent Hill games. And as viewers, I'm not really sure we've managed to cement a rapport yet. But as I'm sure you can tell, I really like old games, horror ones especially. Rough edges, jank and age have never really bothered me all that much, as long as there was a strong art direction, engaging world building, or interesting thematic elements involved.
Down 4 levels. It was really scary.
I like when a game has soul, and Alisa is nothing short of soulful. And for a fan of older titles, this is one of the most convincing old school mimics I've ever played, and is entirely uncompromising in its aim to recreate the feel of games from the late 90s and noughties. I liked it so much I went straight into New Game Plus after beating it for the first time, something I never do. Rarely will I stick around to see everything one game has to offer if it's locked behind another playthrough. I'm lazy and also really impatient, but I was so enamored by Casper Croes' dollhouse that I found it very hard to leave. And hopefully by the end of this video you'll find yourself wanting to get lost in Alisa's labyrinth too. So let's indulge a little and get into why I liked it so much and what's actually on offer from its gameplay to its narrative. The game takes place in a 1920s environment somewhere in Europe. You play as Alisa, a member of an elite royal guard tasked with tracking down a wanted criminal who's fled the city with mysterious stolen blueprints. As you and your team comb the countryside for clues, you come upon a town that is nearly entirely abandoned, save for one lone man, who's been left to lament over the way the village has been abandoned.
Where are all your neighbors?
Everyone went to work in the big cities, since factory work was on high demand and granted more work stability.
He gives you a lead on the thief, and a chase through the looming forest leads you to a clearing, where you are attacked by 3 doll-like creatures. One mandatory loss later and Alisa awakes in a mansion, no longer in her royal guard's uniform, but wearing a blue Victorian dress, an image not unlike that of Alice down the rabbit hole. Soon, Alisa comes to find that the entire mansion is filled with dolls, all afflicted with a bloodlust. Much like the Resident Evils, Galerians, Dino Crises, and Alone in the Darks of its day, time in Alisa is spent surviving a mansion where its inhabitants want you dead, all while slowly uncovering its secrets. There is a great feeling in games like this where you find yourself asking, what actually happened here? But before I get into all that, let's talk about what it's like to play Alisa. Alisa's main aim is to replicate the experience of the survival horrors of the 90s, and it nails the effect perfectly, for better and for worse. The game is viewed entirely through fixed camera angles, which is something I love in games because of the way it allows a developer to create atmosphere and tension through its shots, something a modern title only gets to do in a cutscene, when the player is entirely disconnected from gameplay. You get some really fun moments out of this, like at the start of the game, when you get a brief glimpse of an enemy down the main hall staircase. Further along, there's this really voyeuristic shot where we watch Alisa through a window. I don't know about you, but I was kinda waiting the entire time for dogs to jump through. And of course there are moments where an enemy shuffles about off screen, or when something can be seen lurking just on the edge of the frame. As is often the case with fixed angles, there are a couple of moments where I completely lost my sense of direction and found myself flipping between 2 or 3 shots in a tight space. Although I blame this more on the fact that I used the modern control scheme over tank controls. There are very few exceptions made by Croes in his PS1 throwback, so I was pretty surprised I was even allowed to forego tank controls for the free moving modern control style. Back to fixed camera angles, which I do love. I did find myself thinking about the 180 camera rule a lot while playing, and wondered how much of an adherent to it might have improved my experience on the modern movement controls. The 180 rule being that the camera should stay on one side of an imaginary axis between 2 characters, so that one character always remains frame right, so as to not disorient the viewer. Obviously this is for movies and TV, but I think this would help when taking on enemies or even crossing winding hallways. This is pretty minor, and by my second playthrough I'd gotten mostly used to it, except in the mazes, of which there are 2. Knowing Casper Croes though, he was probably loving how much players were suffering in these environments. And for the most part, I think that the big and bold angle switches are deliberate. Deliberate and authentic care is an idea I'll be coming back to a lot throughout this video, so don't worry, I will return to this thoughtfully. In general though, Alisa's camera is used with great effect for anticipation and surprise. It's one of the tools I miss the most from a generation past, and I'm glad it's something I still get to enjoy thanks to indie game development. The game has you start with a pistol, very kindly left to you by one of the mansion's residents. More weapons and costumes are unlocked periodically as you progress through the game and can be purchased at safe rooms from a hand puppet called Pole. Combat again remains true to the PS1 era. There is one minor compromise, in that when you start the game you're asked if you want to play with auto-aim activated at the cost of some tooth wheels. I said no, I'm a real gamer, which is a decision I really regretted. I'd forgotten how unforgiving games like this could be, and I died an embarrassing amount of times at the start before I was fully used to how I was supposed to be playing. I was missing a lot of shots. There is an indicator in the game's UI that lights up when you're aligned with an enemy, but it was only on my second playthrough that I realised that's what that was for. It does click, and soon fighting the inhabitants of the mansion becomes a breeze for Alisa, especially thanks to weapons like the saber. The melee in Alisa is slightly janky in that way that these games are, and can be exploited pretty hard on the simpler enemies. There are a couple of fights that will put Alisa through the ringer, and you'll definitely have to apply a little more strategy during boss fights, as well as pulling out your guns, but once you learn to parry, the rest of the game's enemies become light work. Something that I did find a little bit strange was how weak the other melee weapons felt in comparison to the saber, which is the first melee weapon available to you. The weapons were made with trade-offs in mind, but being able to throw the javelin or block easier with the sword and shield never trumped the flat damage and parry ability of the saber. Okay, I actually did really like that you could throw the javelin, so I don't know why I'm dragging it here because I used it loads. I guess my point is that there's loads of ways to approach the way you play in Alisa, even if I metagamed it pretty quickly. Versus the obvious games and age that have inspired Alisa, Croes does a lot of borrowing from the new in the loadout system. In that your weapons don't take up any active slots in your inventory, rather you equip them into Alisa's loadout in whatever order or playstyle you want. You're given the freedom to run 2 melees, go all in on guns, or forego weapons entirely for dresses with special abilities in place of your equipment slots. There's a hint of that Souls-like influence here, but Croes also name-dropped Call of Duty when I was talking to him, which was something I was never expecting to hear. Going in, I was a little scared that I might have to deal with a limited inventory system, and I'm really glad that Alisa avoids a lot of the tedium of that. She's allowed to carry whatever she wants, but her inventory is never really overloaded anyway, and all ammunition goes straight to the gun it's for. One holdover from the Resident Evil days of old though, is that Pole does charge you for a save. It's not quite ink ribbons, but enough to add value to a mechanic that often is taken for granted. Okay, this is going to make me sound really cheap, but I would, on occasion, forget if I'd actually saved or not, and I hated forking out the extra tooth wheel just to be on the safe side. After defeating the game's first boss, Dr. Pierre Edmiston, a doctor at the Institute driven mad, Alisa gets access to modifications, which definitely aren't turning her into a doll. They're varying levels of useful. The first one available gives Alisa access to the auto-aim feature I talked about before. Among these upgrades are a dodge that I can't say I ever actually used, and a defense upgrade that really helped the adjustment to Alisa's combat. From a design perspective, all the upgrades fit really nicely into the strange doll-infested world and are a really fun point of contact for the game's themes. The dodge has Alisa being pulled back on strings like a marionette, which works so well thematically and hints at the dangers of actually taking these upgrades, in that we see her agency as a living being slowly erased. It would have been fun to see these upgrades appear physically on Alisa's in-game model, but considering this as a piece of nostalgia, developers were limited in the size and scope of what they could actually achieve in their games, especially when played natively on old hardware. That's one thing I'll mention quickly now. In the endeavour of avoiding anachronism, Croes actually made this game on an older version of Unity, something that continued to ensure Alisa's success as a true PS1 title. So the modifications might not change Alisa's appearance, but you do get to put her in lots of new dresses. It was so fun to see her in different outfits, all of which had their own place in the game. The nurse's dress gives you a bonus on healing, Alisa's guard uniform improves your reload times, and the thief's suit gives you a big damage reduction buff. The game does have a short water section where you'll need the mermaid suit, but thankfully it isn't too grueling, and actually makes for a nice ramp up and challenge given that you're losing a sizable amount of your defense in favour of being able to swim. And if you really resent the idea of forking out the tooth wheels for the outfit, you can remove her garments entirely and go into the water stripped down. Alisa is filled with details like this. It is a really surprising amount of player agency and freedom for a game that, by nature, is limited by a lot of factors. I think my favourite part of the game was letting Alisa sit in a bath for a few minutes, immersed in the steam and the soothing tones of the safe room. The rest of your time in the game is centred on puzzle-based exploration, with a balance of in-the-moment problems and backtracking around the mansion for clues and item solutions. A few of the puzzles are randomised on each playthrough too, so no brute forcing with a walkthrough. This balance facilitates a deeper familiarisation with the game's environments and also gives you plenty of opportunities to feel clever when you figure out one of the puzzles. And it's really nice to feel part of a space, even if it's digital. I'm not a massive fan of when games feel the need to throw endless set pieces at you. I've always liked that feeling in Resident Evil, or even some parts of Silent Hill, when your muscle memory takes you back through the environment, when you don't have to check your map every 2 hallways. That being said, at the start of the game, Alisa will have you doing this constantly, and make zero concessions to something that the new Resident Evil games do. There is no reminder for which key unlocks what door on your map, nor are there indicators for items you may have missed or overlooked. The details are sparse, so I hope your spatial awareness is up to scratch. The last thing I want to touch on in the gameplay section are the boss fights. The visuals and designs are all great, something I'll get into deeper later, but on the gameplay side, this is really where the age of the genre starts to show, and where I usually opted to brute force the fights with medkits. I was reminded of my nearly impossible experience with the final boss of the first Silent Hill, and how Harry Mason was expected to just outright tank lightning bolts while blasting away with his shotgun. It's not quite as bad as that, and there are some nuances to the boss fights, but you will find yourself knocked down repeatedly and often with very little room to reload your gun safely. Once I ran out of bullets or couldn't find a space to reload, the fights usually just devolved into a spinning match, with me swiping away with my saber as the boss tried its best to lock onto me. Okay, I have to jump in really quick to say that this sounds like a massive indictment against the boss fights in the game, and I'll go on to explain why it's not in a moment. But I just want to clarify a couple of things, as I don't think I was being that fair to the boss fights when I first recorded this. Yes, I might have tanked a few hits here and there on a few of the fights, but the first boss is in a spinning arena with loads of hazards thrown at you, which requires you to actually move around the boss arena, rather than just running away from an enemy that's chasing you and stopping to shoot them. And in the second boss fight against Edith Boileau, you can actually pick up the spear she throws at you and throw it back at her, which I feel like hardly anyone knows about. There's also the amazing on-rails shooter fight against Albertus, which I'll talk about properly in like 30 seconds. Anyway, what I go on to say still stands. I just wanted to give credit where credit was due. Call it a cope, but I do really like this element of Alisa, and I do think it's intention design. And also, if our main cause for concern was gameplay, I don't think we'd be talking about Silent Hill or Resident Evil half as much as we do. There are so many parts that make up a game, and if you like nostalgic survival horror, janky gameplay is part and parcel. It's fundamental to this being an authentic experience. I hope this makes an amount of sense. I'm not saying I want it to be bad, I just want it to be accurate. To his credit though, Croes does shake things up for one of the game's final fights, where for 5 glorious minutes Alisa turns into this strange on-rail shooter where you chase down a cherub through the chapel on a big machine gun dog hybrid. I could not believe what was happening when this fight started. It's the perfect amount of weird and camp, and it fits so well. To sort of sum up what I've been trying to say here, the rules and expectations of a game from this period are met constantly, especially in its gameplay. So much so that it can border on frustrating at times, but again, this really feels like the experience that Croes was going for, that these are deliberate choices and not an oversight. I have the stomach for a game like this, but I know plenty of people who don't. This makes it sound like it's a harder or more difficult time than it is. It's absolutely manageable. I just know how put off people can be by a game that shows any crack of age, even if it's in disguise like Alisa. There's been little weavings of visuals and design throughout the video, but in this section I want to focus in on a few things: inspirations, monsters, and sound. I had the chance to speak with Croes about his influences during development. As you'd expect, Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark came up, but so did Alice in Wonderland. Croes had initially intended for the game to follow the beats of Wonderland a little more closely, but found something far more compelling unveiling before him instead. The memory of Alice is definitely there, but we're not talking Disney's Wonderland. Croes instead drew upon the puppet-filled adventure of Jan Svankmeyer's Alice, a Dutch-language film from 1988. This is a far more surreal take on Alice's journey, filled with stop-motion and puppetry. Throughout the film, we get the impression that the Wonderland we're in is the dream of a little girl's dollhouse, which makes for a really nice change from other interpretations of Alice. One look at Alisa's house guests and the influence of the avant-garde Dutch master of puppets is clear. Characters like Elise, one of the game's few dolls that aren't trying to kill you, and the early game marionettes really highlight this influence the most, as well as the game's overall setting of our institute-turned-dollhouse. By the way, Svankmeyer's Alice is free to watch on YouTube, and I recommend everyone do so immediately. It's an amazing piece of cinema history, and probably the best thing to come out of this video for me. The rest of the game's foes are a good mix of goofy and creepy, with some real standouts like the top-hatted monster who crawls around on all fours, and the contortionist who jump scares you in the second safe room. There's loads of variety in what you actually fight in the game, and every enemy has a few details that make them feel distinct. The glass mer-people of the game's flooded basement have breakable limbs and cannon range, while the metal flower foes of the game's garden section collapse and sprout when felled. The models for these latter enemies are incredibly buff and buxom for some reason. I don't really know why, but it did make me laugh. I should have asked Croes about that. To quickly touch back on inspirations, I'm really glad that Croes decided to tread his own path with Alisa, and didn't go all in on something derivative of classic fairy tales and the like. What remains is a project of tremendous passion, and one that feels very distinct from other games in the genre, especially in indie horror, when so many of these games tend to revolve around gimmick scares, played out tropes, and memeable characters. I really want to highlight how successful Alisa is in its aesthetic delivery. The game is a pageant of sorts, an attempt to play house, something I'll elaborate more on when we talk about the story, but basically it's clunky in both nature and design, which I might have said before. Croes' Svankmeyer-esque inhabitants are the perfect pairing to a game with slow, laboured movements such as this, just as zombies were to the original Resident Evil. The actual building that you're in, the St. Johannes Institute, seems to be in part a place of study, rest, and also medical help. One diary entry calls it an asylum, a likely facade for the sinister experimentation that took place. It's a great building to explore and very quickly unfolds into a madhouse, especially in Edmiston's quarters, which has basically been converted into a circus. There's a lot of nonsensical geography here, which just feels so accurate. The basement is aquatic themed. Outside, the garden's overrun with the corrupting metal, and deep upstairs is the chapel, which is grand, imposing, and almost entirely marbled. Though the presentation is fairly simple, there's plenty to keep each area feeling relatively fresh. If I had any critique here, it would be that none of the areas are ever quite as crazy as the circus section. And maybe that's for the better, but this area does appear really early in the game, and the ante is never pushed that hard again. Outside of maybe the forced stealth section or the rail boss fight, but that's gameplay and we're talking environment. Regardless, it feels authentic to itself, and these elements run throughout the entire game, no less in its music and sound design. Alisa is far from a one-note experience, and that's thanks to Croes' wife Arissa, who I feel delivered something really special in the game's music. It's creepy and foreboding, but also audacious and vibrant, as games often were. Basically, it's not very subtle, which I really like, and makes sense contextually when you consider the time period we're aping, but also thematically in the lack of subtlety of the dolls and creatures that inhabit the mansion, who themselves are doing the best to parade whatever remains of their humanity. Because of this, I think Alisa is a far more interesting soundscape than the pure realism of modern AAA titles. The movements of the mansion are accompanied by what you'd expect in the crunchy, compressed sound effects of feet clacking against the marble floor or shuffling along the carpet. But there's also odd and almost out-of-place noises in its diegetic sound. For example, when Alisa is traversing through water, or just in the overall ambience of the manor in the form of scary Minecraft sound effects that play intermittently as you wander around the halls. The nostalgia and playfulness that is woven throughout Alisa's soundtrack and sound design is really special, and for me was one of the game's biggest draws. That playfulness is found in the character of Alisa too, which I almost forgot to talk about. I don't know if it's just the voice acting, begrudgingly done by Croes' wife, or the way she's written, but I love her attitude to the whole situation she's found herself in. Like being in the dollhouse is only a minor inconvenience. She's pretty good humoured about it all, and is a really good sport to those stuck in the dollhouse with her. But at the end of the day, she is still duty bound. So let's find some blueprints. So that's Alisa on a gameplay and aesthetic level, and I appreciate you sitting through about 17 minutes of me talking about it. But what about Alisa's story and lore? On the broader end, Alisa keeps its story relatively close to its chest, but what narrative there is fun, feels fresh, and gives us loads to chew on, even going as far as to have multiple endings that determine Alisa's success in her final moments. There's a pretty decent amount of replayability for such a small indie title. We are still playing in the established beats of survival horror, as in, explore the mansion, acquire keys, solve puzzles, fight bosses, and escape. There's awkward and charming voice acting, cheesy cutscenes, and plenty of diary entries to read.
I was almost a sandwich.
But I can't think of many titles from the 90s outside of the original Alone in the Dark that opt for a historical setting, no less set in Europe with a gentle steampunk edge, in a space that has lost itself to time. Okay, my worst nightmare is becoming one of those channels that just gives a play-by-play of literally every single thing that happens in a game and calls it a retrospective, but I do want to share Alisa's story, themes, and characters with you, so I'll try to keep this section focused on that rather than a descriptive walkthrough. If there's little details omitted like when a key drops or what item goes where, this is why. We know that Alisa is part of a royal guard unit called the Croes, and we know that she's tracking down a thief with stolen blueprints, which ends up with her getting trapped in the Institute. But what happens next? Well, after waking up and finding a gun with a note attached, there's only one thing for Alisa to do. In her first foray out, Alisa finds a doll pilfering another, in a sequence that pays homage to the classic zombie head turn of the Re-games, a nod that made me giggle with excitement on my first playthrough. Alisa is shortly in the game's first safe room, where Pole, a hand puppet talking to her through a hole in the wall, introduces us to the game's systems, and Charlotte, a wardrobe with ambiguous sentience that holds all of your gear. It becomes quickly apparent that Pole isn't going to be a guide or much help during your time in what he calls
There's a dollhouse.
The dollhouse?
Nor is he the one who provided you with the aforementioned gun. All he cares about is your tooth wheels, a type of gear invented within the Institute that all of its inhabitants seem desperately hungry for. So if it wasn't Pole, then who was it? This was left to us by Elise, the doll you didn't know you were saving in the first room. I think this is a good place for us to start when getting into Alisa's story, as Elise's own drama makes up a decent amount of the game's lore and context. The first time Elise is mentioned by name is in a photo kept by the last remaining villager during the prologue, before we're abducted by the doll creatures in the forest. The photo shows us what we assume to be his wife and daughter, named Barbara and Elise respectively. It's too early in the game for Alisa to have been suspicious of this, but their presence here and in the mansion raises a lot of questions, which I will do my best to answer, or at least speculate on. The old man tells us that the village has long been abandoned due to the abundance of work in factories in the city. Even the local church has sealed its doors tight. He claims to have stayed in the village due to age, but there's clearly something else keeping him here. His missing wife and daughter are more entwined with the Institute than we might have first thought. While exploring, Alisa discovers that Barbara was the one in charge, and was there to help facilitate the research of a stony relic called the Finger of God, which resides in the game's chapel area. Donated by the elusive Manor of Tides, elusive as in they're only mentioned twice by name, the stone has the ability to turn organic materials into the inorganic, the source of the mansion's mechanized zombies, glass amphibians, and metal flower people, all former staff and patients who appear to have been wildly experimented on. Why most of these enemies are dressed up like dolls, that comes a little bit later, just bear with. Where this relic actually originated from, we don't know. To me, it looks otherworldly or alien, which might make some sense given that the Institute had an astronomer in its employ. It does look a bit like a meteorite fashioned into a statue. If I were to go for a real stretch, I'd argue something about the moon having an effect on the Earth's tides, which in my head connects to the Manor of Tides, but this is speculation of the highest order. Anyway, the St. Johannes Institute was also home to figures like Dr. Pierre Edmiston, the inventor of the tooth wheels, Isabella Flora, the expert biologist, and Hermann Heinrich Hahn, a master of psychology. It seems like the finger of God was being studied on all fronts, or more specifically its impact on those it affected. By the time we've got to the mansion, it has fallen into complete disarray, most of its residents mechanical and mad. Barbara is nowhere to be seen, and Elise is acting as an agent of the dollhouse. We learn during Alisa's fight for survival that they were losing subjects afflicted by the relic's curse daily. People were petrifying and dying all over the shop. It was Dr. Edmiston who, becoming increasingly obsessed with reanimation, began to experiment on the Institute's rapidly transmuting patients. It was he who began to mechanize them with tooth wheels, first invented for use in a transport system, now the new lifeblood of St. Johannes. Dr. Edmiston is the game's first boss, and probably the maddest of the bunch. One note early on in the game tells us, "We locked up Edmiston. He went too far. Too many patients died from his mindless experiments. First of all, he called it fun. Now he can die there, alone, in his house of fun." What we'll come to realise is that prominent members of the Institute all had their own domain within the grounds, their own worlds to shape as they saw fit, worlds that were rapidly deteriorating in relic-induced madness. Locked up on the building's ground floor, Edmiston's experiments had escalated into a full-blown spectacle. This is the most manic the game ever gets. There's a Sen's Fortress-styled walkway with swinging axes, jail cells, and a circus ring where we can only assume Edmiston was putting his subjects to work in the name of fun. I guess this explains why most of the enemies here are bizarre clowns. One thing that is interesting is that Edmiston appears human, except when you defeat him he's pulled away on marionette strings, and the next time you go to a safe room, he appears as a hand puppet, offering you mechanical upgrades in exchange for your tooth wheels.
So you defeated Beer. Well done.
There, behind you.
Ah!
Is the power so tempting that it's worth Alisa shedding her own humanity? Yeah, now I can get pulled back on marionette strings too. One final thing on this section, in one of Edmiston's rooms, a bedroom, there's a large doll clad in black, trapped in a box. The exact description of Barbara that's found in the photograph at the start of the game. Why is she trapped here, in stasis? That can't be good. Elise leaves us a note on the ground saying that Barbara has escaped and is after her, but that she might sense a similarity between her and Alisa. Okay, I have to derail the story here really quickly to mention a gameplay thing that I forgot about. Barbara serves as a sort of Mr. X nemesis type villain that appears periodically throughout the game to chase you, but unfortunately she's really easily cheesed and goes away after exiting and re-entering a room a couple times. It's never quite as scary an encounter as it should be, and serves mostly as a minor annoyance to your exploration. And also was constantly interrupting the nice soundtrack the game has. Anyway, back to the point at hand, Babs is now loose in the mansion. You can't help but wonder why the Institute's founder was trapped like that. What had the power to subjugate her? Could it have been part of Edmiston's mad descent, a revolt against his employer? I think someone else might have put her there. Someone who's more likely to have a grievance with the facilitator of the experimentation that's occurred here. I should have mentioned this earlier, but not everyone succumbs quickly to the stone's curse. One such survivor might even still be scurrying around, like a rat in the walls. Elise also, for a time at least, seems to have had some sort of resistance to the stone's curse, or at least wasn't afflicted in the same way the others were. I was once just like you, immune. Okay, sorry for all the sidesteps, but we're finally back to Elise. There's a myriad of theories on why she's in the mansion in the first place, ranging from she may have just been brought to work by her mother, or that she was abducted by the Institute's bad actors as things declined. But I think there's something else going on here, and the key is in the notes described earlier, that Alisa and Elise bear a similarity, an immunity. Let's not forget that Alisa is coming into constant contact with people afflicted by the stone's curse. I feel like Elise may have had a role in how things transpired, in that her reaction to the stone was different. Once Barbs is released, she's hell-bent on catching Alisa, up until the point that she catches up to Elise during the next boss fight. Whatever Barbara sees in the both of you is likely why Elise chose to keep you safe at the beginning, or maybe she's just trying to protect you from the fate that befell her. Elise has clearly been put to use by the Institute, observed not just in the game's notes, but also the tools she has when she fights Edith with you. Your success against Edmiston leads you to a flooded basement, where the Mer people have made a home for themselves, united by the Queen of the Sea, Patient 13. Edith Boileau. I'm just going to call her Edith. Edith is a very interesting character, as she's not an agent of St. Johannes, but a victim. She's also the first instance we hear of patients depetrifying, which suggests that not everyone in the building functions thanks to tooth wheels. A glimpse of the Institute's end goal is revealed here too, another step closer to controlling non-organic to organic material. Edith is one of the first in the Institute to mutate as dramatically as this, in that she started to grow tentacles. She began her petrification process with glass skin, as many of the other subjects in the basement section did, but she rapidly grew into something far different, with abilities so strong that she's the reason the basement section is flooded in the first place, much to the frustration of Babs. There isn't loads to go off for Edith, as is the nature of the game as a relatively small indie project. But from what notes there are, we can glean that Edith had become a de facto leader for many stuck in the Institute. I'm not sure if she had a hand in the creation of the glass merpeople, or if she was simply protecting a school of frightened and lost fishies, herself the first to undergo an aquatic mutation. Is it Edith that's being questioned here, or someone else? We first see her asleep in a lavish chair fashioned in a throne room, which, to me, gives the impression of a despotic ruler. A message from Barbara also tells us that she's sick of hearing that patient 13, Edith, is the cause behind the flooding, which aligns with the poem's opening line. Either way, it seems like the fishies knew what they wanted. Being trapped in a tank, so to speak, can't be much fun. With a little help from Alisa after rescuing her leg from thieving dolls, Edith is defeated and we gain access to the gardens, where more context is shared on the timeline of events, as well as putting Alisa one step closer to catching up to a thief of her own and escaping. Notes dotted around the sunken garden tells us of a mining expedition hunting for coal that stumbled upon the fallen Institute instead. But judging from lines like, "Some of the miners started questioning the higher-ups. They pay us well, so I'm not complaining," I'm not so sure that the discovery of the sunken asylum was an accident. Apparently 60 years ago a sinkhole appeared out of nowhere and swallowed this huge asylum or something. You never know what kind of treasures might be buried here. As the dig continued, metal ornaments were unearthed and the miners, emboldened by the promise of riches, began to dig further until... "We found a large cave opening. There are lanterns placed in the cavern. Are there other miners here?" The Institute, preserved underground, had finally been discovered, and with it all of its madness, affliction, and suffering. Some fan theories put the building's burial down to Edith, who we know was affecting the basement, and honestly, there's little to indicate otherwise. The next note we find paints the final picture for these lost miners. "I'm trapped, hiding to save my life. The entrance caved in and men in strange armor chased us, caught some of our men. The screams have stopped. I'm afraid I'm the last one alive. My wounds are full of metal fragments. I can't seem to remove them. I feel empty." Okay, I think we have to look at the timeline really quick. If the game is set ambiguously in the 1920s, and the Institute sunk 60 years before 1891, that would put the Institute's fall sometime around 1830, which would make the old man in the house at least 110 if we're accounting for a normal age of marriage and child rearing. Something isn't adding up here, right? Especially if we're going off the assumption of Barbara as the Institute's administrator. Either the old man at the start is one of those people who just won't die, or he's more in on things than we thought. For a moment I considered whether Barbara was actually Lisa's mother, but had instead sought her out and groomed her from the neighbouring village for her nefarious plans. But given that Elise explicitly calls her mother in one of the game's notes, I find this unlikely. I think the blood relation makes more sense, especially when you think about the photo at the start too. Whether or not this is an oversight from Croes, we'll take it as it is. If this is something I've got wrong, or if anyone else knows better than I, please inform me. Anyway, after a series of gate-related puzzle backtracking, Alisa encounters Isabella Flora, the biologist. Another one of the Finger's many victims, Flora, in her own twisted way, managed to give the flowers in her garden eternal life. This was once a luscious and vibrant space, but has since devolved into a grey, metallic hellscape. Defeating Flora gives Alisa a glimpse of what once was.
Look at my beautiful garden. Flowers of every season, all year long. If only it could remain.
Leo.
All things will one day die, and forsaking the turn of the seasons and the cycle of life has left it cold and violent. I love the end line there, where Alisa herself finishes Flora's sentence. In her final moments, she regains a splinter of the humanity that has long left St. Johannes, spoken through Alisa. I feel like it's also a sign of Alisa's own decline, and the weight things are beginning to take on her too. Progressing through this area, it becomes increasingly obvious that the goal was the study of life, organic transmutation, and immortality, the great irony being the price of which this longevity of life has come with. This forbidden power has left people mad, monstrous, and dead.
Can't let you take it all.
Sorry, I just came to grab this key.
Following the garden, Alisa makes it to the chapel and finally catches up with Albertus Alvarez, the blueprint thief, and the reason we're in this mess in the first place. Albertus doesn't share Alisa's resistance to the curse and has lost his mind, becoming a cherub more akin to a statue than a doll. One phenomenal rail shooter boss fight later, and Albertus has regained his humanity, able in his last moments to warn Alisa that she must know the truth of the blueprints. And also that there's a bomb hidden in the game's library and it's nearly ready, so maybe she should go set it off and get the hell out of here. Here, the game feels very in line with the camp conspiracies of Resident Evil. And I really do wonder whether there's some nefarious warmongers out there in Alisa's world who want to create tooth wheel super soldiers or immortality serums. It's in this chapel area, guarded by Athena and Poseidon, where we see with our own eyes the imposing and mysterious finger of God, preserved behind glass, worshipped in the top floor chapel. A note is also found, the one that tells us of Edmiston's struggle with preservation and restoration of life, and his frustrations with Flora, who seemed so ahead of him in the Institute's ultimate task. But of course nothing has come out as planned. I think the element of worship and religion here is really important to unveiling some of the hidden truths about Alisa's world. The stone is worshipped as a piece of God itself, which begins to reveal the Manor of Tides as a sort of cult. The pursuit of life after death and the control of earthly materials as bestowed by God itself is imperative to their success. The ultimate aim of the Institute is the playing of God, facilitated by the stone hand, just like the hand of a puppeteer, which pulls at the strings of a marionette or poses their dolls. And attempting to wield the stone, to forsake God's natural order, the Institute has become mad, created abominations, fallen into total disarray. Well, now there's only one thing left for Alisa to do. Finish the bomb that Albertus had begun to formulate before he went mad, and to hightail it out of here. Except, there's still one thing that we haven't answered. Who's actually running the dollhouse now? Because we know full well that it wasn't the prerogative of Barbara or any of the Institute staff to dress people up in Victorian doll costumes and play house. And wait, who's been controlling Paul and Edmiston? It's evident by now that the relic affects people differently. Some are petrified and others undergo a series of strange mutations. One such to undergo an organic change was a mentally unwell patient who had come into contact with the stone. Most people who do this end up dead, except for him who went missing. Angry and vengeful, this missing patient made a life for himself in the building's walls, and as the Institute's new factions began to take hold and vie for control, he began to prepare an act of resistance. A resistance to those who experimented, restrained, and controlled him.
Huh? Paul?
Oh, my little doll. Why are you trying to run away from home? I will teach you good manners by disassembling.
This is the Dollmaster, the game's final boss, and the puppeteer who's been pulling the strings during Alisa's time in the mansion. He's the reason we're fighting so many dolls and toys, and the reason Alisa is let loose in the building in the first place. These are his playthings, and play he shall. The Dollmaster's presence in his dollhouse and past subjugation as a patient does seem to shed some light on how Barbara ended up the posable banshee that she is. A lot of the community seemed to think that Edmiston was being used by the Dollmaster, which makes sense when you consider his cruel madness back when he was still alive, his engineering and medical ability keeping him useful. It's only when we defeat Edmiston that he's whisked away on strings. He's failed his duty and is no longer fun to play with. And so he takes his final form as a hand puppet, finally joining Paul. Speaking of Paul, for a while I thought that he was a representation of whoever the Dollmaster may have been before his mutation, but Croes actually denied this to me when we spoke on Twitter, so your guess is as good as mine on this one. Maybe once a friend, could be one of the Institute's many wrongdoers, who knows. Okay, I think that's kind of everything, which leaves us with the game's endings to talk about. The first ending I got saw Alisa succumbing to the temptations of the tooth wheels and being unable to leave the Institute as a result. With his final breath, the Dollmaster basically tells you to try again, but this time, don't take any upgrades from Edmiston. So that's exactly what I didn't do. Sort of. I'll get to that in a moment. The rest of this ending plays out with Alisa bound to the Institute, fully transformed into the doll the Master so desperately wanted her to become. The cutscene's final moments show the Institute surfacing after some sort of earthquake and Alisa escaping, through the lens of an old friend. This gives us a really nice lead into Croes' planned spin-off, and even for future sequels. All in all though, I'd call this a pretty bad ending. As in bad for Alisa, not objectively. So I went into my New Game Plus to see what else was on offer, but my save file was sort of already on the bad ending path, so I went for the next best thing, ending C. The requirements for this was purchasing every single tooth wheel modification from Edmiston, including the secret one you get by not giving Alisa a leg back when you run into her in the basement area. Sorry, Elise. In this ending, we see Alisa completely turn heel, taking her place as Master of the Institute, choosing not to destroy the finger, but to end the Dollmaster's reign for good.
I'll show you power.
The final sequence shows Alisa taking place at the head of her troops with Pole and Edmiston in tow. So these are the endings that I saw, but there are a couple others to talk about. Alisa's good ending is more or less what you might expect. Resist the temptations of the modifications and get out just in the nick of time. The only difference is that we get a glimpse of the city and we finish on Alisa reading the blueprints that had been stolen, and were the MacGuffin for the events of the game. Well, actually I guess if it's here, it wasn't really a MacGuffin, was it? Anyway, who cares? There is one more final secret ending, which honestly is such a cute detail and really rewards those going into the New Game Plus 2s. You know how to get the bad ending, you need to eat all of Edmiston's mods and not give Alisa her leg back? Well, on New Game Plus 2, provided you're on the doll path, you can actually give Alisa a leg back because the upgrades carry over. The ensuing cutscene is pretty similar to the bad ending, but this time Alisa is lazing on the chaise lounge with none other than Elise bringing her a crown, the ominous spectre of Barbara looming in the background. Okay, well that's pretty much Alisa. I am so exhausted and I've been working on this for far too long, so I'm going to call this video here. I had so much fun playing it and analysing all of its little details, and I hope that shows. Looking back, there are some little things that I didn't talk about, but hey, you can go see them on your own playthrough. It's such a charming, weird little game, and I'm so thankful to have found it. Big love to Croes and Arissa, and I can't wait to see what they come up with next. Actually, the Alisa spin-off game, The Parting, is available for wishlist right now on Steam. So instead of liking and subscribing, why don't you go do that instead? I hope you've enjoyed this review, deep dive monster of a video. I don't know if this is going to be a normal occurrence on the channel, but I just wanted to try something a little bit different. Again, thank you so much for listening to me ramble on about it. This was a really fun video to try and make. I have some other bits planned, back in on lore and video game themes, so stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.